So our scripture reading this morning is in the letter of 1 Peter. It's in the end of your New Testaments here. If you have the ESV Story Bible, it's page number 857. We're at chapter 4, verse 12 to the end of the chapter. Peter says, "Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because of the Spirit of glory and of God rests upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. For it is time for judgment to begin at the household of God. And if it begins with us, what will be the outcome for those who do not obey the gospel of God? And if the righteous is scarcely saved, what will become of the ungodly and the sinner? Therefore, let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." The word of the Lord.
Is that this? Is that my microphone? What? Okay. Is it working? Am I on? Well, the lights aren't working up here, and that wasn't intentional to talk about suffering in the dark. It's just a coincidence. We're at the point in 1 Peter where Peter's going to sum up some of the things that he's been talking about in terms of suffering. And 1 Peter as a whole, as Mike already mentioned, we've been talking about this theme of bearing witness to others about the beauty of the gospel, and in so doing, compelling them toward Christ because of the gospel. Well, what this text shows us is that sometimes being a Christian does not compel others toward Christ. It creates a tension. It grates against the things that they know and the things that they do, and it creates a fiery trial for us. So how do we respond when the fiery trial comes, when we suffer unjustly as a Christian? A fiery trial came for a Baptist pastor in the form of a jail cell in Birmingham, Alabama in 1963. Feeling the trauma of the events that led up to his unjust imprisonment, the pain of being isolated from his wife and children, and hurting from the poor treatment of his jailers, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was suffering. In his jail cell, Dr. King wrote these words: "I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the 8th century prophets left their little villages and carried their 'Thus saith the Lord' far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns, and just as the Apostle Paul left his little village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus to practically every hamlet and city in the Greco-Roman world, I too am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my particular hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid." Birmingham was not Dr. King's home, so why would he go to the most segregated and dangerously racist city in America as a black man? He outlines in his letter that he went to Birmingham as a representative of God's justice, as one who believed that all men are image bearers of God, of great worth. Penning in his jail cell, he lays a theological foundation for the actions which led to his suffering. He suffered for a vision of justice that came from God. He explicitly saw himself in continuity with Jesus, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Martin Luther, the prophet Amos, Thomas Aquinas, Augustine, and many other Christian figures. Now, surely Dr. King was suffering because of the color of his skin. but he himself identifies that his stand for justice is grounded in God's will. He embraced the injustice of being in a jail cell to promote God's just character and will and to uphold the dignity of fellow image bearers. The world at this moment was not in accord with Jesus' concern of all people. And Dr. King stood with Jesus. Dr. King suffered unjustly as a Christian, and that's what this text in 1 Peter is all about. How should we respond to unjust suffering as a Christian? How will you respond when the next fiery trial comes? Now, for humans, suffering is a universal experience, since after the life-giving world that God created was refashioned by human hands into a place of suffering, we all will and have experienced pain, hurts, and deeply traumatic events. We've all suffered, and Peter is talking about suffering. But in this case, in this text, Peter is talking about a particular kind of suffering. We need to clarify what kind of suffering Peter addresses in order to receive the kind of encouragement he offers. Let's look at the text to look at what kind of suffering that we're looking at. In verse 15, Peter highlights that our suffering, that this particular sort of suffering is unjust suffering. He says, "Let none of you suffer as a murderer or thief or an evildoer or as a meddler." Peter indicates that their suffering should not result from the just outcome of their actions. This is not suffering that results from doing something wrong and then just receiving what we deserve. And then he also says that our suffering is particularly Christian. In verse 13, rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings. 14, if you are insulted for the name of Christ. And 16, yet if anyone suffers as a Christian. So this does not mean that people will always make this association. We don't necessarily need to be identified as a Christian to suffer as one. But we do need to be living explicitly as a Christian, as Christ would, in order for us to suffer in the way that Peter is talking about. In these situations, our Christian identity often does come out, but sometimes it's merely a result of our Christian convictions. For example, let's propose a scenario. You're at work, and you're thinking, you know what? I'm working all the time, and God created me as a human with limitations. I can't just keep working all the time. I'm becoming a workaholic. Jesus invited me to rest because he tells me that my worth is not in work. So you go to tell your boss the conclusion you've made, that you need to take more days off work and create some sort of healthy pattern of work and rest. Your boss gives you a verbal backlash about how you'll never make it in the marketplace, that you're lazy and uncommitted, and he resents and demeans you for this decision for the rest of your employment there. Now, your boss may never know the Christian foundations of your final decision to take more time off, but his verbal insults would certainly qualify as suffering as a Christian, because Jesus' ways, in this case, taking time, the need for rest as humans, are not in accord with the ways of the world's systems. So in 1 Peter 4, 12 through 19, Peter addresses his audience's unjust Christian suffering. In this kind of suffering, Peter offers us encouragement in what to do and in what not to do. We'll let Peter instruct us, as the text comes, in what to do and in what not to do. And he instructs us in these four major ways. Don't be surprised when suffering comes. Rejoice in suffering. Glorify God in your suffering. And entrust yourselves to God in suffering. Don't be surprised. Rejoice, glorify God, and entrust yourselves to him. Don't think it's a strange thing, Peter says. Don't be surprised. So, okay, doesn't Peter point out that we are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession? What do these realities have to do with suffering? Is suffering familiar to the Christian experience, or is it a strange thing? Peter's first instruction is telling. He instructs us not to be surprised by trials. Are you surprised when you find out your good friend and housemate has betrayed your trust by saying nasty things about you when you're not around because of decisions you've made that reflect your Christian identity? Or when a parent consistently and caustically criticizes you about how raising kids with Christian ideals is making them weak and pathetic? If you're caught off guard by suffering, you will not be prepared to give an answer for the decisions that reflect your Christian identity. If you're not expecting suffering, you'll be tempted to return the insult back when it comes, rather than offer no insult in return. If you're surprised, you might become filled with anger or disillusioned in your walk with God. Be encouraged in your unjust suffering, because it's not a strange place for you to be in as a Christian. Suffering is not a stranger to this household. Why? Because Jesus Christ is the cornerstone of our suffering. 1 Peter 2, 4 through 6 and 7 reads, "As you come to him, a living stone rejected by men in the sight of God, chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ." Verse 7, latter half. "The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone." Jesus was rejected, and he suffered at the hands of those who rejected him. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're a stone built upon a house with a cornerstone that's chosen by God, yes, but rejected by many. Jesus predicts his own suffering, and then he goes on to predict the suffering of those who follow him, we read in the Gospels. You might be thinking, well, the way that I live as a Christian is very relevant. I'm a very likable person and loving of all people. But Jesus says that a servant is not greater than his master. If they persecuted me, they will persecute you. The Son of God suffered, so you as a follower should not be surprised by it. This passage also highlights that suffering offers a purifying effect. He says, "Do not be surprised at the fiery trial that is happening to you to test you." And then later in verse 17, he writes, "For judgment begins with the household of God." The judgment in the house of God is sort of like this purifying effect. The future judgment, the future decision of God is already beginning. Those who are enduring the suffering of trials are showing themselves as God's own in the present. And so this process of dividing who is his and who's not has already begun. 1 Peter 1, 6 through 7 says that these trials test our faith to provide a purifying effect on our allegiances. Jesus modeled what it means to suffer without surprise, because he knew that God had use in his suffering. Matthew 16, from that time, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, "Far be it from you, Lord, this should never happen to you." But he turned and said to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan. You are a hindrance to me, for you are not setting your mind on the things of God, but on the things of man. What kind of person will respond well to unjust suffering as a Christian? It's the type of person that's not caught off guard. And be encouraged. If you're in it, it's no strange thing for a Christian to experience. So his first instruction is not to be surprised. And his second is not to be surprised, but rejoice insofar as you share in the sufferings of Christ. What does this mean? What does it mean to share or participate in the sufferings of Christ? That's kind of an abstract idea. Let's break it down in terms of playground theology. Let's imagine a playground at recess, and there's a bully who wants to prove his worth. So he figures he'll have to give a show of his strength to show his worth to others. He finds his target that will help show others how powerful he is. He's going to beat the pulp out of this kid to prove his worth. A different kid steps in and says, "Hey, don't beat him up, beat me up instead." The bully is confused and looks to him and says, "Why didn't you just say, 'Hey, don't beat anyone up'? Why would you offer to be beat up instead?" And the kid responds, "Because after you're done, I want you to stare into my puffed up, beaten, bloody face. I want you to see where your mission of proving your worth at all costs leads. I want you to stare at the ugliness of your selfish mission in the face. From now on, I want you to think about my bloody face when you think about the lengths you'll go to prove your worth." And isn't this what Jesus does for us? Isn't this what Jesus does for the world? He takes the form of a human body and tells us the way of life. Why couldn't he just tell us and be done with it? Why did he suffer also? Because we are so brazenly out of control and zealous and set on doing things our way that we would spit on, whip, and kill God himself to keep doing what we want. The display of Jesus' broken, bloody body hung on a wooden log is a vivid demonstration of where our way leads. To keep our way, we killed God. Jesus suffered on the cross to offer the world a vivid display of sin. At the expense of his life and body, he invites us to stare into the face of our sin. Suffering was Jesus' gift of love to the world, to us. And it was redemptive. And we can rejoice when we share in Jesus' suffering that shows people the end of their sin. But the only way people see their sin most clearly is when we suffer unjustly, representing God's ways. Our unjust suffering gives them an opportunity to see the end of their sin, the ugliness of their sin. Martin Luther King wanted the world to see racist hearts on full display. So in the same letter that I mentioned earlier, Dr. King says it in this way: "We had no alternative except that of preparing for direct action, whereby we would present our very bodies as a means of laying our case before the conscience of the local and national community. We were not unmindful of the difficulties involved." When you suffer in this way, like Christ, you participate in the sufferings of Christ. A cosmic bond is formed. You're in cosmic connection with the God of the universe. We can rejoice in this bond. Not that we rejoice in the pain of suffering itself, but we rejoice that we're in union with Christ in this moment. Why is being a parent so hard? Because sometimes you suffer unjustly the tantrums and fits and anger of telling your child that they will not have their way, that their way is neither right nor best for them, and that it is not God's way. And you suffer through their tantrum with patience, so that they may one day come to terms with themselves, not with their parents' many faults in response. Verse 13b also highlights that we rejoice because it will heighten our experience of joy at the return of Jesus. But rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. Our experience of suffering will be met with the beauty of God's kingdom, absent of tears and pain. In verse 14, Peter continues to give us reason to rejoice and to be encouraged when we suffer in the name of Christ, because God calls us blessed. And because the Spirit of glory and of God, he says, rests upon us. Usually when we see suffering or when we're experiencing suffering ourselves or are wounded or hurt, we naturally think that we've lost favor with God. Or that God does not favor us, that he's punishing us or disappointed in us. We think that God is no longer present with us and wonder how it is that he's left us in this position of pain or hurt. We think it must mean that he is no longer with me and for me. And thankfully, Peter shows us that we couldn't be more wrong in these moments. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, God calls you blessed. And he uses language from the Old Testament to say, in the most powerful way that he can, the Spirit of God and of glory rests on you, that he is with you, that he is present with you in your unjust suffering as a Christian. Just as the glory of God took up residence in Israel's camp, God's Spirit takes up residence in your camp. When you suffer, God is in your camp. And if God is in your camp, you are blessed. So Peter's instructions for us in unjust Christian suffering thus far are not to be surprised by it and to rejoice insofar as we share in the sufferings of Christ. And then he says our suffering is also supposed to lead us to the glory of God's name. Glorify God's name. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if anyone suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. When we suffer for something we do wrong and receive the just outcome of our actions, God doesn't receive any glory in that. Peter points out that there are wrong ways to suffer, and we need to take great care. So I have one example to talk about. Unjust suffering is not the same. Unjust suffering as a Christian is not the same as the oversensitive victim complex that we see in our culture and that we sometimes take up as well. Our culture believes that if you're not oppressed in some way, then you don't deserve a voice. So we exaggerate or even invent ways to be oppressed, to become the persecuted minority. Like when Starbucks stops printing wintry themes on their cups. There are a few problems with this way of operating. First, Peter says that we shouldn't be surprised by suffering. Not that suffering is inevitable for a Christian at all times. With this distinction in mind, this should not cause us to develop a martyr complex where at the end of every situation we're the victim. We can't mistake disagreement for unjust suffering. If someone sharply but respectfully disagrees with you or doesn't affirm your way of life as a Christian, that's neither oppression nor suffering. This point also helps us see that if you're not suffering unjustly as a Christian right now, that's okay. That's okay. There are meaningful ways for you to identify with Christians here and around the world who are. What's not good is if you try to draw attention to yourself when you're not really suffering. Second, reason why there's a problem with this is that casting ourselves in a posture of victim or oppressed, it actually makes the suffering about us. These are my rights that are being violated. I'm experiencing suffering. Look at me. We are not out for pity as Christians. There's a lot in what Jesus did that had to do with silence. Do we have that? Actually, okay, well. I came across this particular tweet, which was not about Christian witness, but about Muslim witness that I was going to put up there. And the first person says, here in the U.S., I think this highlights the problem. Here in the U.S., every hijabi woman I know has chosen to wear it voluntarily, sometimes to the dismay or even opposition of friends and family. And a woman who practices this, she responds, "Yep, I am neither oppressed nor voiceless. I chose to wear hijab on my own as an adult. It's one of my voices." So, third, when Christians, when we suffer as Christians, in a sense, we're not oppressed at all. Because John 9:18 says, "He laid his life down of his own accord." Jesus, in a sense, was not oppressed. We chose to follow Jesus, who predicted his own sufferings and then our own. We knew that suffering was ahead when we took up the call to discipleship. So Christians don't play the game of trying to outsuffer others in order to have the credibility for witness. These things are one example of how suffering does not draw others into the beauty and into the glory of Christ and of God. Darrell Charles writes in some, "Christians should be known for what they do, not for what they suffer. Fixation upon the difficulties of life robs the believer of the opportunity to display his concern for the welfare of others." So don't be surprised by suffering. Rejoice in it and glorify God in it. And finally, entrust yourselves to God. Therefore, verse 19 says, "Therefore let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good." Peter's conclusion and last piece of instruction to those who suffer in this way is to entrust themselves, give themselves over to their faithful Creator by doing good in suffering. This, in a way, encompasses the other 3 points. And this may be the most difficult. When someone insults you, verbally abuses you unjustly, do you entrust that situation to God instinctually? Or in your heart, do you take control of the situation and begin fantasizing about the insults that you could give in return and about how much hatred is building up towards your insulter? The book Night is Elie Wiesel's own story of unjust suffering in a Nazi concentration camp. Now, Wiesel was not a Christian, but I think this illustrates the point. Throughout the book, Elie writes about how on several occasions he told himself he would not become like some of the other prisoners who did despicable things. And he particularly says that he would not do like some of the other boys had done, abandoning the care of their own father to preserve themselves. But this is exactly what Elie ends up doing. And at the end of the book, he's staring in the mirror. And it's the first time he's seen himself since being in those camps. And he doesn't recognize himself. Because in the face of suffering, he had become like his oppressors. Wiesel demonstrates with stunning clarity that in the face of suffering, we often mirror the image of those who afflict us more than that of the innocent Christ. We don't entrust ourselves to our Creator. And it's this stunning clarity that makes Jesus' suffering without sin so incredible and so beautiful and so redemptive. He committed no sin. Neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. Amen.